The moral world can feel chaotic and arbitrary when judged only by outcomes. In the next 20 minutes, we will learn a different route, one that Immanuel Kant called the categorical imperative, and that asks us to think like citizens of a moral republic instead of passengers in a lottery. This video will open the doors to a philosophy that demands reason, dignity, and consistency from every action as if all humanity were watching. You will see how a simple test changes arguments about lying, promise-keeping, and human dignity, and why that change still matters today. Immanuel Kant was a late 18th century German philosopher who reshaped moral thought with brutal clarity. He refused to measure morality by consequences alone, and instead demanded a rational structure behind every good action. Kant believed that moral duties arise from reason itself, and that practical reason can produce laws as binding as physical laws. His ethical architecture was meant to give human beings a dignified place in the moral universe. At the heart of Kantian ethics sits the categorical imperative, a test for moral action that refuses exceptions based on desire. This is not a suggestion or guide to personal preference, but a command of reason that applies to rational creatures universally. Kant contrasted categorical imperatives with hypothetical imperatives, which advise actions for contingent ends, like training for a marathon if you want to finish. The categorical imperative, by contrast, orders action without reference to any particular desires or goals. Kant actually offered several formulations of the categorical imperative that are meant to be expressions of one underlying moral law. The first formulation asks us to act only according to maxims that you could will to become universal law without contradiction. The second formulation demands that we treat humanity always as an end and never merely as a means to an end. The third formulation imagines a kingdom of ends, a community where rational agents legislate universal moral law together. The universalizability test sounds simple, but it is deceptively rigorous when applied to everyday life. You must ask whether the maxim behind your action could be willed consistently as a universal law without contradiction or self-defeat. To make this practical, you have to state your maxim clearly. Imagine everyone following, and then check for logical or practical contradictions that would make the maxim impossible or destructive. This simple intellectual exercise forces moral reflection away from personal exceptions and toward principles. One famous example involves a person considering a lying promise to borrow money. If the maxim were, "I will lie to get a loan when in need," then universalizing it would make promises meaningless and ruin the institution of promising. Kant argues that if the practice of promising were destroyed by universalization, then the maxim cannot be willed as a universal law without contradiction. The action therefore fails the universalizability test and is morally impermissible according to Kant. Another useful illustration concerns a shopkeeper who is honest only because of fear of losing customers. Kant would ask whether this honesty truly counts as moral action driven by duty. Acting merely in accordance with duty is not the same as acting from duty, Kant insists. To act from duty means the moral law motivates you independently of desires, consequences, or inclinations. Kant sees worth in motives, arguing that only actions done from duty have full moral worth. The difference between acting in accordance with duty and acting from duty is one of inward moral character and genuine respect for law. Inward motivation separates a performative good deed from a truly moral act according to Kantian standards. This focus on motive makes Kantian ethics distinct from consequentialist approaches, which evaluate actions solely by their outcomes. Kant believes the moral law must shape will and intention, otherwise actions are morally incomplete. Kant's second formulation, treating persons as ends and never merely as means, centers human dignity as an absolute moral principle. People, as rational beings, possess intrinsic worth that forbids using them as mere instruments for other ends. This does not prohibit all forms of mutual use or cooperation, but it requires consent and respect for persons' autonomy. The moral wrong occurs when a person is manipulated, deceived, or reduced to a tool without regard for their rational agency. Consider a scenario where a doctor lies to a patient to prevent worry in the short term, intending eventual good consequences. Kantian ethics would challenge this approach by asking whether lying treats the patient merely as a means to an end. If the lie bypasses the patient's rational capacity to decide for themselves, then dignity and autonomy have been compromised. Kant would demand truthfulness because it respects the patient's ability to govern their own life in accordance with reasons, not manipulative paternalism. The kingdom of ends formulation asks us to imagine a community where every rational agent treats each other as ends and legislates universal moral law. This thought experiment shifts moral deliberation from personal idiosyncrasies to the perspective of a moral legislator. It invites us to evaluate actions as if we were crafting laws for a community of equals. The kingdom of ends thus fuses universality, dignity, and autonomy into a single moral vision that aspires to communal rationality. Autonomy, for Kant, is the capacity of rational beings to give themselves moral law rather than being governed by desires or external authorities. Moral autonomy is not mere independence, but obedience to a law you recognize through reason as binding. Kant saw autonomy as the source of dignity and moral responsibility because it makes each person a lawgiver in the realm of ends. Without autonomy, moral praise and blame would lose their meaning since agents would lack the capacity for principled choice. Kant's ethics are not sentimental. They demand courage and sometimes sacrifice because duty may conflict with inclination. This sternness produces both admiration and discomfort for those who prefer moral flexibility based on outcomes. Yet Kant believed that adherence to duty forms the backbone of a just moral order, and that moral law commands respect even when it runs contrary to personal desires. The nobility, in Kant's view, lies in acting for the right reasons despite personal cost. No philosophy is immune to critique, and Kantian ethics draws several important criticisms worth considering carefully. Critics claim that Kant's system is too rigid and fails to give practical guidance when duties conflict severely. Other critics argue that Kant neglects consequences and human emotions, which often matter morally in ways reason alone cannot capture. There are also worries that the universalizability test can be interpreted subjectively depending on how a maxim is formulated. A typical objection asks what happens when duties collide, such as when telling truth could lead to someone's death. Kant famously maintained that truth-telling is absolute, even if this leads to terrible outcomes, and this answer troubles many. Some defenders of Kant try to reconcile conflicts by careful analysis of the maxims involved, or by invoking distinctions like perfect and imperfect duties. Others accept that Kant sets ideal standards and leave practical dilemmas to supplementary moral reasoning. Another criticism centers on Kant's strict separation of motive and consequence, as if outcomes never matter for moral evaluation. Utilitarians and virtue ethicists respond that consequences and character traits are indispensable for assessing good action. Kantians reply that consequences are unpredictable and cannot ground universal laws, which must be stable and rational. The debate, therefore, hinges on whether ethics should primarily command rational conformity or promote beneficial results for sentient beings. Kant's emphasis on dignity and autonomy has had enormous influence on modern human rights language and legal frameworks. The idea that humans have inherent worth captures the moral intuition behind rights-based arguments and constitutional protections. Even critics of Kant sometimes adopt his language of respect when defending human dignity in clinical ethics, international law, and political discourse. His conception of persons as ends continues to animate debates about consent, privacy, and personhood. In bioethics, Kantian reasoning crops up in arguments about informed consent, bodily autonomy, and the inviolability of persons. Medical ethics often draws on Kant when insisting that patients cannot be treated merely as means to research or societal ends. Kant's insistence on respecting persons helps shape protocols that protect vulnerable subjects from exploitation and manipulation. These principles are not just philosophical abstractions, but practical constraints designed to safeguard human agency in medicine. Kantian ethics also appears in contemporary debates about artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making. When machines make choices affecting people, Kant's demand to treat persons as ends suggests we must design systems that respect autonomy and dignity. Questions arise about whether algorithms can ever be moral agents, or whether they simply implement human maxims in coded form. Kant's framework pushes us to consider whether our rules and policies imbue machines with respect for persons, or whether they merely instrumentalize human lives. In business ethics, Kant's categorical imperative challenges practices that reduce workers or customers to means for profit. Corporate policies that treat people as instruments for revenue arguably fail Kant's test of respect for persons. Managers and policymakers can use the universalizability test to evaluate company maxims and avoid exploitative practices. When businesses adopt Kantian language about dignity and autonomy, they commit to structural changes that protect employees and consumers alike. Kant's moral vision can also inform environmental ethics through the idea of universal laws that rational agents would will for the future. If we imagine our actions as laws for a global community, then sustainability begins to look like a rational requirement, although Kant did not directly write environmental ethics. His emphasis on universal responsibility and respect for future rational beings can ground arguments for conservation and intergenerational justice. Thinking as members of a kingdom of ends extends moral concern beyond immediate human interests. Applying Kant in daily life requires translating abstract maxims into real-world decisions with honesty and clarity. When you face a choice, state your maxim and subject it to the universalizability test, imagining everyone acting the same way. Ask whether your action would respect the autonomy and dignity of those affected, and whether you could will the maxim as law. This reflective practice helps convert moral intuition into disciplined reasoning and cultivates a consistent moral character. Kant's ethics also cultivate moral courage by encouraging individuals to act on principle even when costly. Choosing duty over convenience builds a reputation for integrity that can transform relationships and institutions over time. Moral consistency creates trust because others can predict your actions based on principles rather than whims. In this sense, Kantian ethics functions not only as personal philosophy, but also as social technology for producing reliable moral agents. Despite its demands, Kantian ethics remains compelling because it anchors morality in respect for persons rather than in shifting tastes. When politics and markets become transactional, Kant's reminder of dignity becomes a resistance strategy to dehumanization. The categorical imperative invites us to build institutions and practices that could be justified to all rational beings, rather than those that merely serve narrow interests. This aspiration continues to inspire reformers, jurists, and everyday people who seek a more just world. We can also learn from Kant's limits by integrating his insights with other moral theories to address complex problems. Combining Kantian respect for persons with consequentialist concern for outcomes can produce a balanced ethical toolkit for real-world decisions. Philosophical pluralism does not mean abandoning principles, but rather using complementary perspectives to pursue justice more effectively. Kant gives a backbone to ethical thinking that, when paired with other approaches, becomes more flexible without losing its moral seriousness. Kant's influence reaches beyond philosophers into law, medicine, and civil rights, showing that abstract ideas can reshape institutions when taken seriously. The categorical imperative provides a language for dignity and autonomy that institutions can translate into procedures, codes, and norms. When people speak of rights and respect, Kantian terms often echo beneath the surface, even when they are not explicitly cited. That legacy proves the power of moral reasoning to alter collective practices and protect vulnerable lives. Yet the real test of Kant's ideas is not clever argumentation, but lived practice that respects others as ends. Philosophy becomes meaningful when it alters how we speak to neighbors, how institutions treat citizens, and how societies legislate basic rights. To live Kantian ethics is to ask in every small interaction whether your maxim could be universalized and whether your behavior treats others with respect. This day-to-day disciplined reflection can slowly change cultures toward greater dignity and justice. At its best, the categorical imperative reminds us that moral law springs from our shared capacity for reason and mutual recognition. This is not a call to narrow obedience, but an invitation to join others in legislating moral norms together. Kant gives us an ethic of citizenship for a moral republic where each voice matters, because each person is a legislator of reason. That political dimension makes his philosophy both ethically demanding and socially transformative. If you take one thing away from Kant, let it be this: morality asks us not only what works, but what we can will everyone to do. The test of a good life is whether its principles could be universalized without contradiction and with respect for others. Kant challenges us to live intentionally, to let reason shape our will rather than transient appetites. That challenge remains urgent in a world of short-term incentives and systemic pressure to treat people as instruments. Philosophy can sometimes feel remote, but Kant's ideas matter because they provide a test for public morality that ordinary people can apply. Whether discussing privacy laws, healthcare policy, or workplace practices, Kantian questions cut through rhetorical fog to demand consistency and respect. Applying the categorical imperative is an act of civic responsibility that strengthens the moral fabric of institutions. It forces accountability because universality exposes double standards and hypocrisy in public life. In the end, Kant invites us to imagine a moral community governed by reason and respect, rather than by desire and power. That vision can feel austere or inspiring depending on how much dignity you think humans deserve by virtue of being rational beings. The categorical imperative is not a silver bullet for moral complexity, but it is a compass pointing toward fairness, mutual recognition, and principled action. It provides a vocabulary for holding ourselves and others accountable in the public square of reasons. If this video has shifted your perspective even slightly, consider carrying the categorical imperative into your daily conversations and decisions. Practice formulating maxims, test them for universalizability, and ask whether your choices respect the autonomy of those affected. Philosophy lives in action and in the subtle reforms of character and institutions, not only in lecture halls. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and join the conversation about what it means to live with moral dignity. Thank you for watching and engaging with difficult ideas that shape public life and private conscience. Kant's categorical imperative asks more of us than convenience, but it promises dignity and a principled world worthy of our reason.